Okay, so for this video, we're moving on to Schedule B, Parts 1 and 2 of the 5471. So as a reminder of the required information chart, if we look back at this, you can see here Schedules B Part 1 and Schedule B Part 2. When are these required? Well, they're required when you have a Cat 1A filer, 1C, or Cat 3, 4, 5A, or 5C. You'll recall in our case, our U.S. person, John, he basically hits all of these, right? So he's the 1A, 2, 3, 4, and 5A. So he's got to do Part 1 and Part 2 of Schedule B. So the schedule is broken into two parts, obviously. Part 1 covers the U.S. shareholders of the foreign corporation, right? So who are ultimately going to be these U.S. shareholders? And then Part 2 asks for the direct shareholders. So basically you're completing Part 2 first, right? Who is the direct owner of the stock in the foreign corporation? So if we look back at our structure chart here, remember, here we have the offshore corporation, the Cayman Islands Corporation, and the direct shareholders are these two parties. So John Q. Taxpayer, he's the U.S. citizen and U.S. resident individual. He's a 75% owner. And then the second direct shareholder is this Bermuda holding company. Now, ultimately, the owner here, and what the IRS likes to see is who are the ultimate natural persons that own all of these stocks. So if you have tiers of different holding companies, who is ultimately, the person at the very top there that's going to be the beneficial owner? So Jane Doe, remember, she's not a U.S. tax person. She's not a person. She's a Bermuda citizen and resident. So in our case, really what we have to disclose here is just John Q. Taxpayer and his ownership interest in the company. So the direct shareholders here, I have listed each shareholder. So we have John Q. Taxpayer. We have his Social Security number, or his, if the direct shareholder is a company, you might have the company name and the EIN. We've indicated U.S. as their residence, and then the type of stock he owns and the number of shares. So he's common Class A shares, and he owns 750 of those shares out of the 1,000. Now, the second direct shareholder is that Bermuda holding company. So I've listed the Bermuda holding company here, their address in Hamilton City, Bermuda. They do not have a U.S. tax ID number. Again, that's fine because they're not a U.S. tax resident. They don't file an 1120-F. Also owns the common stock, Class A shares, and 250 or 25% of that 1,000 shares issued and outstanding. Now, I've seen some presentations where, if the direct shareholder isn't a U.S. company or there isn't an ultimate U.S. beneficial owner, they don't list it. I like to list it all just for completeness so it's clear who are the direct shareholders here. And then what's really important, obviously, is to get this right? Who are the U.S. shareholders of that foreign corporation? So if we got the direct shareholders here, and then we list which ones of the direct are U.S. persons. So in our case, John is, so he gets listed again up here. And then if any U.S. persons were owners in some of these companies, would they be listed up here as well? In this case, no, right? So a direct shareholder is a Bermuda holding company, but those shareholders are not U.S. persons. So that's why on the U.S. shareholders list here, we just have John's information. So we have John's name, his address, his Social Security number, the class of stock that he owns, and again, they have the note here, right? It should match the corresponding description on Schedule A, right? So that was Schedule A up here for page 1, where you have common Class A, and so you need to use the same descriptions just so it's very easy for the IRS to trace exactly what type of stock and how much is owned by these U.S. persons, by these direct shareholders. So we've got 0 for the number of shares held at the beginning of the period, number of shares held at the end, and then pro rata share of the Subpart F income. So we'll certainly get to Subpart F income later in another video, but what they're after here is, okay, once we compute Subpart F income, obviously we need to know how much is going to be allocated to these U.S. shareholders. And so in this case, John owns 75% of that stock, so he's going to get allocated 75% of any Subpart F income that might be allocated to him. Now, even in cases where you might not have any Subpart F income, or maybe you have guilty income, I still like to enter the percentage ownership here, even though it just says pro rata share of sub F. Enter the percentage again, and just so it makes it clear how much income, if anything, even if it's just an actual cash dividend distribution, is going to be allocated to them. So in this case, we will have Subpart F income, so I have entered 75 to indicate 75% is going to be allocated to John. And that's sufficient for this form. Now, if we want to touch on maybe a minor modification to the fact pattern and see how this would change, let's look at the fact pattern here. What if, for example, we had Jane Doe, and she was instead of a Bermuda citizen and Bermuda resident, let's say she was a dual citizen, right? So what if she was a dual citizen, and so she was Bermuda and U.S. citizen, and she was living in Bermuda? Well, if you're a U.S. citizen, no matter how many citizenships you have, you're generally always a U.S. person. You're always a U.S. citizen. You're always a U.S. tax resident. So if she had this same structure chart, and she owned her interest in this offshore company via the Bermuda holding company, then the way that we would modify this Schedule B here, we would still list these two as the direct shareholders, but in addition to listing John up here, we would list Jane's information, right? Because if Jane was a U.S. person, a U.S. shareholder, and she held her interests via a Bermuda company, or even perhaps another foreign partnership or something to that effect, then we would have to disclose her U.S. shareholder ownership interests up here. And we would do the same thing. We would have her name, her address. We would list out that she owns common stock, Class A, the number of shares at the beginning of the year, number of shares at the end of the year, and then her allocation of whatever that Subpart F income is. Right, and so that's how this schedule would modify a little differently. For purposes of this tutorial, again, I'm trying to keep this example fact pattern as simple as possible, just to illustrate some of these concepts and how we would complete the forms. So that's why I only have one U.S. person in this mix. That's John. And we do have a tiered structure here with another Bermuda holding company in there. But ultimately, this is a foreign company, and it's got a foreign owner. So that's why we do not need to list any ultimate U.S. shareholders that would be shareholders in that Bermuda company up here. Okay, so that covers it for Schedule B. Again, you can always reference the 5471 instructions for different additional details on how this should be completed. But given the fact pattern we have in front of us, this is the information that needs to be disclosed, and that's enough to move on to the next video, where we cover Schedule C for the Form 5471.